Franz Kafka. If you think life is fair, keep waiting. He portrayed humans as trapped in nightmarish absurdity. For example, in The Metamorphosis, Gregor cries out in frustration, "Oh God, what a strenuous career it is that I've chosen," highlighting how Kafka saw work and duty as crushing rather than ennobling. Kafka wouldn't bluntly call you stupid. Instead, he'd show you a world where you're lost. He'd find you hiding from a faceless bureaucracy, like in The Trial, and think, one more sheep bewildered by the system. His style makes a point. Your routine life jobs, rules, small talk is inherently absurd and unfair. He'd treat you like Joseph K., arrested without cause, reminding you that you could vanish at any moment, even if you've done nothing wrong. In Kafka's view, every human is at the mercy of incomprehensible forces. So he wouldn't call you an idiot outright. He'd show you how the world already treats you like one by ignoring your pleas. Arthur Schopenhauer. Of course, human beings are doomed. Schopenhauer might snap in his deepest sarcasm. He saw people as deeply flawed and vain. In The Wisdom of Life, he observes that one's utter insignificance and worthlessness becomes painfully clear in an honest self-assessment. In fact, Schopenhauer complains that he alone knows the entire worthlessness of merit, meaning he believed our achievements and pride are essentially empty. In his view, ordinary people chase meaningless goals and then feel let down. This philosopher's gloom implies that any praise you lavish on yourself or humanity is overblown. To Schopenhauer, human merit is almost laughably undervalued. Schopenhauer was famous for his misanthropy. He thought people easily delude themselves with vanity or hope. If he were talking to you, he might sigh that your dreams of greatness are insignificant and worthless in the grand scheme. Rather than give comfort, Schopenhauer would point out that compassion and humility are the only true ethics, not achievements. In short, he'd likely tell you bluntly that your self-importance is overestimated, echoing his quote, that no one truly recognizes how worthless our merits are. Ludwig Wittgenstein. Keep quiet if you can't say it simply. Wittgenstein didn't insult people personally, but he'd certainly mock our confusion. He viewed philosophical problems as traps set by muddled language. As he famously said, "Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language." In other words, he believed we humans often talk nonsense without realizing it. If he addressed you in his sharp tone, he'd basically ask, "Why are you letting language confuse you?" Rather than curse people, Wittgenstein teaches humility. He would remind you that many so-called problems arise only when words are taken out of context. He'd laugh at anyone treating casual phrases as eternal truths and invite you to tame your bewitched mind by clearer speech. In Wittgenstein's eyes, the fault isn't your intelligence, but the tricks your words play on you. So while he wouldn't call you an idiot outright, he would scold you for being bewitched by language, suggesting you often fail to truly grasp reality because of careless speech. David Hume. Don't flatter yourself, oyster. Hume had the coolest take on human significance. The life of man is of no greater importance to the universe than that of an oyster. In other words, you are not a cosmic superstar. Hume bluntly shrugs off human grandeur. To him, what happens to you is just as trivial as what happens to a shellfish. This can feel like an insult. Hume is telling you that your worries and pride are likely misplaced vanity. He'd say you expend huge effort and emotion on problems the universe doesn't care about. You, like everyone else, perish quietly, having failed to move any mountains beyond your own vanity. Hume's tone is matter-of-fact, not spiteful, but it is scathing. In his view, you're just as insignificant as any other creature, no more special than an oyster. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Oh, the joke's on you for sticking around. In Notes from Underground, he spews disgust at the weak and hypocritical. For example, he declares that to live past 40 years old is a sign of moral failing. Who does live beyond 40? Answer that. I will tell you who do, fools and worthless fellows. In other words, Those older than 40 are either fools or scoundrels, he snarls. He also bitterly notes, man is stupid, phenomenally stupid, or rather, so ungrateful that you could not find another like him. His words, man, include you and everyone else. Dostoevsky's point is dramatic. People are perverse and thankless. He paints humanity as delighting in its own suffering and sin. He would lean close and whisper that if you're still alive, you're no better than a fool chasing illusions. In the underground man's view, humans profess reason, but choose irrational suffering out of spite. So to Dostoevsky, calling you worthless isn't just trolling, it's a statement of how he believes mankind truly behaves, selfishly and stupendously ungrateful. Diogenes, you lie, cheat, stink, and I'm not impressed. Diogenes would grunt. As the cynic of the lamp, he famously proclaimed that the world was full of ignorant, worthless creatures. One tale tells how he marched around Athens in broad daylight with a lamp, declaring, I am looking for a man, and finding none except ignorant, obedient, and worthless creatures. In other words, the only people he saw were fools. Diogenes was notoriously rude. He'd likely turn to you and spit out an insult. In fact, he quipped that if humankind went extinct, there should be as much cause for regret as if flies and wasps passed away. When mocked on the street, he even exclaimed he'd have to convince people of anything, only to hang themselves. So yes, Diogenes literally thought humans deserved such contempt that their best fate might be self-elimination. His sarcasm, "Stand out of my sunlight," was aimed at Alexander the Great, showing he valued nature, sunlight, over human pomp. Diogenes would directly call you a piece of shit in intent, because he'd say, you're no better than a parasite clinging to society's teat. Albert Camus. Hope? You call that hope? Fool, Camus might snarl. The champion of the absurd, Camus derided blind optimism. He famously contrasted two kinds of people, those who despair of events and those who still have hope for the human lot, and he ended up calling that latter one a fool. In other words, he thought anyone still believing in an ultimately just outcome for humanity was naive. He saw humans as driven by absurd rebellion, not by happy endings. Camus wouldn't necessarily call you worthless. He'd pity you for expecting a happy script. He'd say life is inherently meaningless, and if you cling to hope, you're only setting yourself up for misery. For him, life is a sum of miseries, opposed by the faintest of hopes, but hope dies in the sunrise. If he lectured you, he'd say you're a fool for trusting human goodness or for hoping your petty struggles will matter. He might even point out that only by fully acknowledging this absurdity can you become the absurd hero, unlike you, who cling to comfort. So Camus' barb is either you face reality and rebel, or you're the fool in denial. Immanuel Kant. Out of your crooked wood, humans can't build straight minds. Kant famously quipped in an essay that, from such crooked timber as humankind is made, nothing entirely straight can be made. In less poetic terms, he thought people are inherently imperfect. You included. He knew our reason and will are biased. Left alone, we tend toward error. That's not an insult in the angry sense, but it is damning. Kant thinks your moral wood is warped. He would remind you that unless you force yourself to obey the categorical imperative, you'll likely act selfishly. Thus, you remain a flawed creature until you discipline yourself by duty and reason. To Kant, calling someone an idiot misses the point. Instead, he sets a higher bar. He'd hold up the moral law to your face. Are you using your freedom to act fairly? If not, you've fallen short, just like everyone else with crooked timber. Leonardo da Vinci. Huh, you think you can outsmart nature? Leonardo would raise an eyebrow. Leonardo da Vinci admired nature's perfection and was skeptical of human arrogance. He believed the human-made world is often clumsy next to natural design. While he didn't rant like Diogenes, he might chuckle at your pride. Human subtlety will never devise an invention more beautiful, more simple, or more direct than nature. He'd imply you waste effort trying to improve nature when you should be learning from it. Leonardo's tone would be teasing, not cruel. He'd point out how we make clunky machines instead of mimicking a bird's wing. You, in his eyes, are a trainee still studying nature's blueprint. Expect a smirk, not a scream. To him, you're simply earnest and ignorant, not evil or stupid, just ordinary and subject to nature's laws. In short, Da Vinci would say your best bet is to follow nature, since trying to out-invent it only makes you look foolish. Emil Cioran. Congratulations, you're too late. The ultimate pessimist, Cioran had no patience for life. He once declared that it's not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late. In other words, by the time you finally give up, life's cruelty has already worn you down. If you think this addressed only suicide, remember he meant it as a jab at existence. Even your rebellion is overdue. Cioran would most of all call attention to your despair. He'd say you and everyone else should start dead earlier, to avoid the meaningless grind. He might grin and remark that living on is overrated, because in his view, you never manage anything great anyway. He saw humans as perpetually disappointed, stuck in pointless routines. So, rather than idiot, he'd find you hopeless. Congratulations on continuing at all, he might sneer. His worldview is relentlessly bleak. You don't just stumble through life. You enjoy that suffering, only realizing your degradation too late. René Descartes. Maybe everything around you is a trick, Descartes might murmur. He was famous for doubting everything, including people's senses. Descartes would caution, the senses deceive, and it is prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. In plain English, he'd say, we humans are easily fooled if you rely on your senses, like thinking you're great just because someone praised you. He might not hurl insults, but his message to you is chilling. You cannot even trust your own eyes and ears. For Descartes, that means you should doubt common beliefs, including beliefs about yourself. He essentially treats humanity as a self-deceiving creature. Are you sure you exist? He once asked with cogito ergo sum, meaning, if you can doubt, at least you must be thinking. But beyond that bare certainty, Descartes is suspicious. So in modern terms, he'd think calling someone idiot is unnecessary when your brain is already tricking you enough. Instead, he'd suggest you question your assumptions rather than get puffed up with human vanity.